In the coming months, the Titans Return toy line will give way to Power of the Primes, centered around the original 13 primes from ancient Cybertronian history. But who are these robots? And just what is a prime anyway? You may be surprised to learn that in the very earliest years of the Transformers franchise, prime didn't mean anything. It wasn't a title or a rank, it was just Optimus Prime's surname, which early Marvel Comics stories showed he had long before he became Autobot leader. It wasn't until 1986's The Transformers the movie that the word began to take on any greater meaning, when the matrix of leadership passed from Optimus Prime to Hot Rod and transformed the young Autobot into Rodimus Prime. Other previous leaders who had carried the matrix would later appear in the cartoon, but they weren't named at the time. It was the Marvel comic that took the concept to its logical conclusion a few years later, when it established that all Matrix bearers before Optimus had Prime in their names as well, from Optimus's predecessor Sentinel Prime, back to the first Matrix bearer, Prima. Though it stood in open and unresolved contradiction to those early stories, Prime was now clearly established to be the title of the Autobot who bore the Matrix, and was derived from the name of the Transformers god, Primus. Over time, however, the significance of the Prime title became diluted. More and more characters started carrying it, most notably in Japan, where primes were known as convoys, and where it was actively reduced to a military rank held by multiple characters simultaneously. They did try to keep the rank tied to the Matrix, as each convoy carried a power source known as an Energon Matrix, cast in the original's image, but by the mid-2000s it had become so genericized that the Unicron trilogy was using it for commanders who had no Matrix of any kind. This dilution bled back over into English language media too, reaching a low point with Transformers Animated, in which multiple Prime-ranked Autobots served under a higher-ranked Supreme Commander, Ultra Magnus. Hasbro didn't like seeing the term applied so freely, and took to actively curtailing its use in toy lines so that it wouldn't lose its special meaning. None of the Unicron trilogy convoys were named primes in Hasbro's version of the series, besides Optimus himself, and some animated characters even had their names changed so their toys wouldn't bear the title. To reaffirm the specialness of being a prime, Hasbro soon laid out a new vision for exactly what that meant, a vision that first took form in 2009's Revenge of the Fallen, which went far beyond just being a rank or a title, and which remains the way that it has been used in all major media since. Today, being a prime is treated as a divine birthright, an innate quality, not something a bot can become just by adding the word to the end of their name. As put simply by Optimus Prime in dialogue deleted from Revenge of the Fallen, primes are born, not made. Though many bots have held the title, Optimus is now typically presented as the first true prime to have existed since the original primes created by Primus, with every bearer of the name to have existed between them and him, like the fascist Nova Prime, the unscrupulous Sentinel Prime, or the imperious Zeta Prime, being a pretender to the throne. And that brings us to the topic of those original primes. Their story is a complex one, which began in 2004 in the pages of Transformers: The Ultimate Guide, a guidebook written by longtime comic book scribe Simon Furman. In this book, Furman introduced the idea that, before creating the whole Transformer race, Primus first birthed a group of 13 Cybertronians to help him claim victory in his battle with Unicron. Now, Furman was likely taking some inspiration for the concept from The Covenant, a group of 12 Zodiac-themed Transformers he had invented for a story exclusive to BotCon, the official Transformers convention in 1999, who were Primus's test run before creating the Cybertronian race. But where the Covenant had all been original characters, the few members of the 13 named in the Ultimate Guide were pre-existing figures drawn from previous Transformers media. But most of the group went unnamed and remained a mystery. A mystery that Hasbro really latched onto. Over the next half-decade, they began to flesh out the group's ranks with original characters, and developed a complex lore for them that was, at first, slowly drip-fed through obscure sources like convention panels, online Q&As, and the Transformers Collectors Club comic. This lore presented the 13 as incredibly powerful beings, each said to perform a unique role or represent a unique aspect of Cybertronian life, and all designated as primes. But in keeping with the new definition of the term as an innate quality, not conferred by a title, only some of them actually had the word in their names. If you've ever tried to read about the 13, one of the most confusing and complicated elements of their history you're likely to have come up against is the fact that, like Primus and Unicron before them, Hasbro presented them as singular beings in the Transformers multiverse, unique entities who existed in all universes and were the same in each of them. Now, I talked about this phenomenon before in episode 4 of the basics, but in the case of the primes, as they moved from appearing in more obscure fan-targeted media to mainstream mass-market works, it proved an unsustainable approach. As their story began to be told in more detail, most notably in the Revenge of the Fallen movie and then the Transformers Prime cartoon, the characters' histories in each new telling proved increasingly incompatible, with even the group's size and membership starting to differ from story to story, which resulted in more and more out-of-universe, rule-rewriting, quantum mechanics gobbledygook to justify the differences. Consequently, the whole idea was eventually abandoned and written out via some more quantum jargon by the Collectors Club in 2015. Meaning there are now various totally different versions of the Prime story spread out across different universes, just as there are with every other Transformers character. And you don't have to pull your hair out trying to figure out how they're all supposed to fit together. But before we talk about those different stories, let's talk about exactly who the Primes are. As noted, membership in the group has fluctuated, but Hasbro created a canon list of 13 for the aligned continuity, which has since been used consistently across all major modern media. Some of these characters have interesting and involved histories of their own that'll make them good subjects for future episodes of the basics. But for now, the Primes are Prima, Warrior of Light, original bearer of the Matrix, wielder of the Starsaber, introduced in the Marvel comic. Vector Prime, guardian of time and space, created for Transformers Cybertron. Alpha Trion, records keeper of the Primes and custodian of the megacomputer Vector Sigma, who debuted in the Generation 1 cartoon. Solus Prime, the first female Cybertronian, blacksmith of the Primes, who created many of their artifacts and weapons. Micronus Prime, the first Minicon. Alchemist Prime, student of the elements, bit of a drinker. Nexus Prime, the first combiner, able to create more of his kind with his enigma of combination. Onyx Prime, the first Cybertronian with a beast form. Amalgamus Prime, the father of transformation, from whom the transformation cog is descended. Quintus Prime, scientist and creator of life, progenitor of the Quintessons. Liege Maximo, liar and manipulator, representative of evil as a natural counterforce to good, and who first appeared in Marvel's Generation 2 comic book. Megatronus, warrior of darkness and entropy, who became known as the Fallen, when his name was stricken from history after he was cast out for betrayal to become the first Decepticon, and who debuted in Dreamwave Productions comic books. Megatronus' betrayal is a key element in all versions of the Prime's story. In Furman's original telling, he joined forces with Unicron, forcing his siblings to banish him and his Dark Master across the dimensions. In the live-action movies, his desire to destroy Earth's sun turned him against his brothers, leading them to sacrifice their lives to stop his plans. In the aligned continuity, after defeating Unicron, the Primes fell to war with one another when Liege Maximo's cruel manipulations led Megatronus to kill Solus Prime in a fit of rage. This war marked the end of the Age of Primes, and they mostly left Cybertron, retreating to their other-dimensional realm of the Primes. But they would play a role in the 2015 Robots in Disguise cartoon, with Micronus training Optimus to combat the return of Megatronus. IDW's comic books have taken the story of the 13 in a somewhat different direction, since in this universe, they're not Primus' first creations, but rather the leaders of the 13 tribes that formed on the planet during its prehistory. As in aligned continuity, they fell to war after Megatronus killed Solus and went on to vanish from Cybertron, but their shadow has been hanging over the IDW universe for several years. Multiple colony worlds founded by the Primes have featured in the series, Onyx Prime's return has been foreshadowed, and Liege Maximo has recently escaped from exile, all pointing towards a seemingly inevitable climax in the comics tie-in to Power of the Primes. But you might have noticed, That's only 12 primes. The 13th and final prime is a figure of mystery, his name also forgotten by history like Megatronus's. In the aligned continuity, he was the uniter who brought his brothers and sisters together as one, but when the age of primes came to an end, the 13th prime chose to give up his life to ignite the well of all sparks, the font from which all Cybertronian life was subsequently birthed, only to emerge from the well reincarnated without his memories of his past life as Orion Pax, who would later become Optimus Prime. IDW continuity is less clear on the matter. There, the 13th is known only as the Arisen, and while many have come to believe that Optimus Prime is this legendary figure, Optimus himself doesn't believe in such things. And for the sake of completeness, alternate members featured in more obscure stories have included Logos Prime, also known as Sound Blaster from Transformers Cybertron, Autonomous Maximus, aka the last Autobot from the Marvel comic, and various members of the Guiding Hand, the pantheon of gods introduced in IDW's comics. Just this very week, IDW even introduced Septimus Prime, a 14th Prime who was slain by Megatronus during the consolidation of the 13 tribes. But going forward, it seems unlikely that these extra characters will be revisited. Hasbro has their list of 13, each about to be immortalized as Prime Master action figures in the Power of the Primes toy line. Except for that ever-mysterious 13th Prime, who'll be represented instead by the Matrix itself. Beyond that, exactly what spin the toy line and tie-in cartoon will choose to put on the Prime story, well, we'll just have to wait and see. And you know what? That's just Prime. And those are the basics on the Primes. Thanks go out this episode to Liam Shalou for our new logo design. Don't forget to check out the basics on Patreon, where you can find a new way to support the show with a new reward tier that lets you pick the subject of a future episode.